Victoria's great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, surpassed her record as the longest-reigning British monarch by 7 years. 70 years and 214 days on the throne. But here's what made that possible. It wasn't luck. It wasn't genetics. It was something a 5-foot-tall woman built in the 19th century, an institution so durable it outlasted world wars, revolutions, and the collapse of every other major European monarchy. The Russian Empire fell in 1917, taking the Romanovs with it. The German Empire crumbled a year later, ending the Hohenzollerns. The Habsburgs vanished. The Ottomans collapsed. Crowns toppled across the continent like dominoes. But the British monarchy survived. And here's the paradox that nobody talks about. The woman who built that survival mechanism spent the first 18 years of her life as a prisoner in her own home. The bedroom was never hers alone. Every single night for 18 years, the young princess was required to sleep in the same room as her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Their beds were positioned so close that Victoria could hear her mother breathing in the darkness. This wasn't maternal devotion. It was surveillance. The future queen, who would preside over the largest empire the world had ever known, spent her formative years as something closer to a captive than a child. They called it the Kensington System. Sir John Conroy designed it, an Irish army officer with charm, cunning, and a barely concealed hunger for influence. Conroy had positioned himself as comptroller of the Duchess of Kent's household after Victoria's father died when she was just 8 months old. He understood what few others grasped with such calculating clarity. This little girl stood in direct line to the throne. Whoever controlled her when she became queen would control Britain itself. So he devised a system of restrictions so comprehensive that Victoria would never have the opportunity to form independent relationships, independent thoughts, independent will. She couldn't descend a staircase without someone gripping her hand. She was forbidden from ever being apart from an adult. She was required to write in a behavior book daily, her every action scrutinized and recorded for correction. She was isolated from children her own age, denied ordinary friendships that might have given her perspective, or allies. The cruelty of it was in the details. Victoria wasn't permitted to meet with visitors without her mother present. She couldn't read books that hadn't been approved. She couldn't play freely, speak freely, or think freely. Every moment of every day was choreographed to ensure that when she finally reached the throne, she would be utterly dependent on the two people who had controlled her childhood. Her prison wasn't just psychological, it was physical too. Kensington Palace, where Victoria spent her childhood, wasn't the gilded sanctuary you might imagine. The palace had been divided into grace and favor apartments for various royal relatives, and the Duchess of Kent's quarters were dark, cramped, perpetually cold in winter. Victoria's world was bounded by these walls, by her mother's watchful presence, by Conroy's constant scheming in the background. Conroy's ambitions extended beyond mere influence. He wanted to be formally recognized as Victoria's private secretary when she became queen, a position that would give him direct access to power. Some historians have suggested his relationship with the Duchess of Kent went beyond professional partnership. Whether or not that's true, what's certain is that Conroy saw Victoria as his investment, his retirement plan, his path to greatness. And he was absolutely ruthless in protecting that investment. When Victoria fell seriously ill with typhoid fever in 1835, Conroy saw opportunity. He pressured the 16-year-old girl, weak and feverish, to sign a document promising to appoint him as her private secretary when she became queen. Victoria refused. Despite being desperately sick, despite the pressure from both Conroy and her mother, she would not sign. It was the first real glimpse of the iron will that would later define her reign. She later described her childhood as rather melancholy. She recalled that she had led a very unhappy life during those years, starved of affection and autonomy in equal measure. She found solace in her dolls. She had over 100 of them, which she dressed elaborately and used to create her own miniature worlds. Worlds she could control. Worlds where she was in charge. But here's the thing Conroy and the Duchess failed to understand. Their system was creating exactly the opposite of what they intended. Every restriction taught Victoria the value of freedom. Every night spent in her mother's bedroom deepened her determination to one day have a room of her own. Every forced entry in that behavior book strengthened her resolve to write her own story when she finally had the power to do so. The relentless surveillance taught her the importance of privacy. The constant manipulation taught her to recognize it in others. The tiny girl, she would grow to exactly 5 feet tall, a height that would become one of the great paradoxes of her reign, was quietly forging herself into something her captors never anticipated. A sovereign who would cling to independence precisely because she had been denied it for so long. And the wider world beyond Kensington Palace was shifting in ways that would shape everything. Britain in the 1830s stood on the edge of transformation. The Industrial Revolution was gathering steam, quite literally, as factories multiplied across the Midlands and the North, drawing workers from rural villages into crowded, belching cities. Manchester's population had exploded from 75,000 in 1801 to over 300,000 by the 1830s. Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, all were growing at rates that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The Reform Act of 1832 had just reshaped the political landscape, extending the vote to portions of the middle class and eliminating the notorious rotten boroughs that had given tiny constituencies disproportionate parliamentary representation. There was change in the air. Uncertainty about what Britain was becoming and what role the monarchy would play in this new industrial democracy. The previous Hanoverian kings had been, by turns, mad, profligate, and embarrassing. George III had suffered bouts of mental illness that rendered him incapable of ruling. George IV was despised for his extravagance. He spent millions on his personal pleasures, while ordinary Britons struggled. He was massively overweight, heavily in debt, and openly contemptuous of his wife Caroline, whom he tried to bar from his own coronation. When he died in 1830, the Times observed that there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures. William IV, Victoria's predecessor, was well-meaning but undistinguished. He was 64 when he became king and had little experience of governance. His reign was short, just 7 years, and largely uneventful. The monarchy's reputation wasn't merely tarnished, it was genuinely precarious. Republican sentiment had real support in certain quarters. Radicals questioned why Britain needed a monarchy at all. The cost of maintaining the royal family drew criticism. The institution seemed out of step with an age of reform and industrial progress. It wasn't obvious in 1837 that Britain would still have a functioning monarchy in 1901, let alone in 2022. And yet, despite the political precariousness of the institution she would inherit, despite the smallness of her stature and the narrowness of her experience, despite the best efforts of Conroy and her mother to turn her into a tool of their ambitions, Victoria was about to become queen. King William IV was dying. He had held on longer than anyone expected. Some said he was determined to survive until Victoria turned 18 in May 1837, specifically so that she could reign in her own right rather than under a regency controlled by the Duchess of Kent and Conroy. If that was his intention, he succeeded. Victoria celebrated her 18th birthday on May 24, 1837. William IV died less than a month later. On the evening of June 19, 1837, he slipped away at Windsor Castle. In the early hours of June 20th, a delegation of ministers arrived at Kensington Palace with news that would change everything. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain roused the household in the pre-dawn darkness. The girl who had never been permitted an unobserved moment was about to inherit an empire. The scene that unfolded has become one of the foundational images of Victorian mythology. But its true significance lies not in pageantry, but in a quiet assertion of will. When Victoria was awakened and informed that the king had died, she received the Archbishop and the Lord Chamberlain in her dressing gown, hair loose, manner composed beyond her years. She was 18 years old. She'd spend every single night of her life sharing a bedroom with her mother. Victoria revealed what 18 years of confinement had actually produced. Her first act as queen was not a proclamation, not a political maneuver. It was simpler and far more radical. She asked to be left alone. According to eyewitness accounts, one of Victoria's earliest requests after receiving the news of her accession was to spend an hour by herself, without attendance, without her mother, without Conroy hovering in the background. An hour alone. It sounds like nothing, the sort of solitude most people take for granted before breakfast. But for Victoria, who had never been permitted such independence, it was a revolutionary declaration. She was asserting, in the gentlest possible way, that the Kensington system was over, that she was no longer their possession, that she was queen, and she would rule herself. The second act followed swiftly. That same day, Victoria ordered her bed moved out of her mother's bedroom, the bed that had stood beside the Duchess's for 18 years. The physical symbol of Victoria's captivity was carried to a room of its own. The gesture was unmistakable. Victoria wasn't merely becoming queen. She was becoming a person, claiming the private space that had been denied her since infancy. The Duchess of Kent, who had expected to serve as regent, or at least as the Queen's most intimate advisor, found herself suddenly and comprehensively sidelined. Victoria moved her to apartments on the far side of Buckingham Palace. Mother and daughter would go days without seeing each other. When they did meet, Victoria was cool, formal, distant. Conroy, who had invested decades positioning himself as the power behind the throne, discovered there would be no power to wield. Victoria froze him out with a determination that bordered on iciness. She refused to appoint him to any official position. She barely acknowledged his existence. Within weeks, it was clear that the new queen would be taking advice from Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, not from the mother who had controlled her childhood. Melbourne was everything Conroy was not: cultured, worldly, warm, and, critically, content to advise rather than control. He became something like a father figure to the young queen, guiding her through the complexities of constitutional government while respecting her autonomy. Their relationship was affectionate but appropriate, built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. This moment of personal liberation was also the beginning of something far larger. By insisting on her own autonomy, by refusing to be managed, manipulated, or controlled, Victoria was establishing a template for the kind of monarch she would become: stubborn, fiercely protective of her prerogatives, deeply suspicious of anyone who tried to impose upon her. These weren't the qualities Conroy had tried to instill. They were the qualities that emerged from resistance to Conroy, and they would prove essential to the transformation that Victoria and her future husband, Prince Albert, would bring to the British monarchy over the next 6 decades. The coronation on June 28, 1838, was Victoria's formal assumption of power. Westminster Abbey was packed with dignitaries. The ceremony lasted 5 hours. A ring that had been made too small was forced painfully onto Victoria's finger. She would need ice to remove it later. The Archbishop placed the crown on her head, and she was, officially and ceremonially, Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But the real coronation had happened a year earlier, that morning at Kensington, when she demanded an hour to herself. Everything that came afterward, the longest reign in British history up to that point, the transformation of the monarchy into a symbolic and moral institution, the stabilization of a crown that had seemed precarious just years before, and ultimately the dynasty that would produce Elizabeth II, flowed from that first assertion of independence. The woman who stood exactly 5 feet tall had stepped out from under the shadow of her mother and Conroy and into the full light of history. But that full light made her a target. On June 10, 1840, just 4 months after her wedding to Prince Albert, Victoria was riding in an open carriage up Constitution Hill when a man stepped forward from the crowd. Edward Oxford, an 18-year-old barman, raised 2 pistols and fired both at the Queen from a distance of just a few paces. He missed. Victoria, who was pregnant with her first child, remained remarkably calm. Albert threw his arm around her. The crowd seized Oxford, and the Queen, rather than retreating to the safety of Buckingham Palace, ordered the carriage to continue its planned route through the park. She understood something instinctive about monarchy. Hiding showed weakness. Continuing showed strength. Oxford was the first of at least 7 people who would attempt to assassinate Victoria during her reign. In May 1842, John Francis pointed a pistol at her carriage. It misfired. The next day, the very next day, she went out again in the same carriage along the same route, hoping to draw him out so he could be captured. Francis took the bait and was seized. 2 days after that, another man named John William Bean attempted to shoot her with a gun loaded with paper and tobacco. 3 assassination attempts in 3 days. The tiny Queen kept going. In 1849, an unemployed Irishman named William Hamilton fired a blank-loaded pistol at her. In 1850, a former army officer named Robert Pate struck her in the head with his cane, crushing her bonnet and leaving a bruise that lasted weeks. In 1872, Arthur O'Connor, a 17-year-old, charged her carriage with an unloaded pistol. And still, she continued her public appearances. Still, she rode in open carriages. Each assassination attempt, rather than undermining her, seemed to strengthen public affection. She was brave. She was resolute. She was their queen. This pattern of survival through visibility, through showing up, through refusing to hide, would become part of the institutional template she passed down. When German bombs fell on Buckingham Palace during World War II, Victoria's great-great-granddaughter Elizabeth and her mother would stay in London rather than flee. The lesson had been taught. The lesson had been learned. Victoria's early reign, though, wasn't without missteps that had nothing to do with assassins. In 1839, just 2 years into her reign, she found herself at the center of what historians call the bedchamber crisis. When Lord Melbourne's Whig government fell and Sir Robert Peel was asked to form a new Tory ministry, Peel requested that Victoria replace some of her ladies of the bedchamber, most of whom were wives or relatives of prominent Whig politicians, with wives of Tories. Victoria refused. She viewed Peel's request as an assault on her personal prerogatives. She dug in her heels with the same stubbornness that had served her so well in breaking free of the Kensington system. Peel, unwilling to begin his ministry with such a conflict, declined to form a government at all. Melbourne returned to power. Victoria had won, but at a cost. The episode exposed her as partisan, as politically entangled, as willing to place personal loyalty above constitutional norms. It was a young queen's mistake, and it would take decades for Victoria to fully learn the lesson it contained. That the monarchy's survival depended not on winning political battles, but on rising above them. There was another scandal that same year, the Flora Hastings affair. Lady Flora Hastings, one of the Duchess of Kent's ladies-in-waiting, developed an abdominal swelling that court gossips attributed to pregnancy. Victoria, who despised anyone associated with Conroy and her mother, was too quick to believe the rumors. She had Lady Flora examined by court physicians. Lady Flora was not pregnant. She had a liver tumor. She died 5 months later, and public sympathy swung sharply against Victoria. The press attacked her as cruel and vindictive. She was hissed at during public appearances. For a moment, it seemed possible that the young queen's reign might founder before it truly began. These early crises taught Victoria something important. The crown was more fragile than it appeared. Public opinion mattered. The monarch couldn't simply do as she pleased without consequence. These were lessons she would carry forward. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha entered Victoria's life in 1839 and married her in February 1840. The wedding took place at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a white dress, a choice that would help establish white as the traditional color for wedding gowns in Western culture. She was deeply, passionately in love. "I never spent such an evening," she wrote in her journal after their wedding night. "His excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness." Albert was handsome, intelligent, and serious-minded. He was interested in arts, sciences, and moral improvement. He would become the driving force behind the Great Exhibition of 1851, which showcased British industrial achievement in the Crystal Palace, a massive glass structure in Hyde Park that drew 6 million visitors over 5 months. But Albert was also, crucially, committed to the idea that the monarchy should stand above partisan politics. This wasn't merely personal preference. It was institutional survival. The previous Hanoverian monarchs had often intervened in political affairs, sometimes clumsily, and the result had been to entangle the crown in controversies that eroded public respect. George III had lost the American colonies in part because of his stubborn insistence on policies that alienated the colonists. George IV's political meddling had made him enemies across the spectrum. Albert understood that in an age of expanding democracy and an increasingly assertive parliament, the monarchy's future lay not in competing for political power, but in transcending it. The sovereign should advise and warn, but ultimately defer to the elected government. The crown should represent the nation as a whole, not any particular faction. Victoria initially resisted sharing authority with her husband. The Constitution gave her the power, not him. She was queen, he was merely prince consort. But Albert was patient, methodical, and genuinely brilliant. Gradually, he became her most trusted advisor. They worked together at matching desks. They reviewed state papers together. They raised a family together, 9 children in total, born between 1840 and 1857. Together, they began reshaping the crown into something new, a symbolic, ceremonial, and moral institution, not a direct political force. This shift, quiet, gradual, sometimes imperceptible to contemporaries, would prove to be the most important thing Victoria ever did. More important than the empire's expansion, more important than the jubilees and the processions and the jewels. She was building a monarchy that could survive. The 1840s brought challenges that tested this evolving institution. Britain faced economic depression, political unrest, and the specter of revolution that swept across Europe in 1848. France overthrew its king. Uprisings erupted in the German states, in the Austrian Empire, in Italy. The old order seemed to be crumbling everywhere. Britain, too, had its radicals. The Chartist movement demanded political reforms, including universal male suffrage. On April 10, 1848, Chartists planned a massive demonstration in London that many feared would spark revolution. The government mobilized 85,000 special constables. The Duke of Wellington positioned troops throughout the city. Victoria and Albert, pregnant with her 6th child, were quietly sent to the Isle of Wight for safety. The revolution never came. The Chartist demonstration fizzled, but the episode reinforced a lesson. The monarchy survived not by force, but by remaining above the fray. While kings fell across Europe, Victoria remained because she represented stability without oppression, continuity without tyranny. Then came the Crimean War. In October 1853, the Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia. Britain and France, fearing Russian expansion into Ottoman territory and toward the Mediterranean, joined the conflict in March 1854. What followed was a military campaign that would expose the chaos and incompetence of the British military establishment and give Victoria one of her most lasting legacies. The war was a disaster of logistics and leadership. British soldiers landed in Crimea without adequate supplies, medical provisions, or winter clothing. The charge of the Light Brigade in October 1854, 600 cavalry riding directly into Russian artillery, became a symbol of magnificent futility. More men died of disease than combat. Hospitals were filthy, understaffed, overwhelmed. Florence Nightingale's nursing mission to Scutari would become legendary, but Victoria's contribution was quieter and, in some ways, more enduring. She had been following the war with intense personal interest, writing letters to soldiers, visiting wounded veterans, and working to understand the conditions her troops faced. On January 29, 1856, she announced the creation of a new military honor, a decoration that would be awarded for valor in the face of the enemy, regardless of rank or class. It would be made from bronze. Legend held it was cast from Russian cannons captured at Sebastopol, and would bear the simple inscription, "For Valor." The Victoria Cross. It was the first British military honor awarded without regard to rank. A private soldier who showed extraordinary courage would receive the same medal as a general. Victoria personally distributed the first 62 medals at a ceremony in Hyde Park on June 26, 1857, pinning each one onto the recipient's chests herself. The tiny queen, standing barely to the shoulders of the soldiers before her, had created an institution that would last. The Victoria Cross remains the highest military decoration in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries to this day. It has been awarded 1,358 times since that first ceremony, and it carries her name. Now let's talk about scale. The British Empire that Victoria inherited in 1837 was already substantial, but it would grow to almost inconceivable proportions during her reign. By its peak, the empire covered 35.5 million square kilometers, nearly a quarter of the Earth's total land area. It held dominion over 412 million people, roughly 23% of the global population. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," became a cliché precisely because it was true. At any given moment, somewhere in Victoria's realm, the sun was shining on British territory. Canada to New Zealand, Hong Kong to Cape Town, Jamaica to India, Australia to Singapore, the Falkland Islands to British Guiana, Gibraltar to Ceylon. Think about that contrast for a moment. A woman confined to her mother's bedroom for 18 years. A woman who stood 5 feet tall. A woman from a small island on the western fringe of Europe, presiding over an empire larger than Rome's at its height. The expansion during Victoria's reign was relentless. India, already largely under British control through the East India Company, was brought directly under Crown rule after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Vast territories in Africa were acquired during the "scramble for Africa" in the latter decades of the century. Burma, Malaya, Fiji, Cyprus. The list of acquisitions seemed endless. And yet, this vast expansion was in some ways secondary to the transformation Victoria would work upon the monarchy itself. The empire might have grown regardless of who sat on the throne. What Victoria built, the institutional model that would enable her dynasty to survive world wars, decolonization, and the collapse of every other major European monarchy, was something more deliberate, more lasting. The technological revolution that exploded during Victoria's reign made her position both more powerful and more paradoxical. The telegraph spread across Britain and then across the world during the 1840s and 1850s. Information could now travel at speeds previously unimaginable. The first public telegraph line in Britain opened in 1839, connecting Paddington to West Drayton. By the 1850s, telegraph wires crisscrossed the country. By 1866, a transatlantic cable connected London to the Americas. By the 1870s, cables stretched to India and Australia. The woman who stood 5 feet tall in London could now communicate with governors and viceroys thousands of miles away within hours rather than months. The railway network, crisscrossing Britain, grew from a few hundred miles of track in 1837 to over 15,000 miles by 1870. It transformed the kingdom into a single economic unit and carried the Queen herself on royal progresses that brought her physically closer to her subjects than any previous monarch had been. Victoria was the first British monarch to travel extensively by train. She had a specially designed royal carriage, complete with a bed so she could sleep during overnight journeys. Steamships shrank the oceans. The voyage to India dropped from 6 months under sail to 3 weeks under power. News from the colonies that once took months to arrive now came in days. The empire that Victoria ruled was held together not merely by force, but by technology, by the cables and rails and ships that allowed a small island on the western fringe of Europe to project authority across continents. This technological web made the scale contrast even more striking. Here was a woman confined to her mother's bedroom for 18 years, now presiding over an empire that stretched across a quarter of the globe. The isolation of her childhood had given way to a connectivity no previous ruler had ever possessed. Victoria could send orders to India, receive reports from South Africa, issue proclamations to Australia, with a speed that would have seemed miraculous to her predecessors. The very technologies shrinking the world also magnified her presence within it. The Queen was no longer a distant figurehead, glimpsed occasionally in official portraits. She was a constant, reassuring symbol of continuity, transmitted through telegraph wires and printed in newspapers that circulated throughout the empire. Photography, too, played a role. Victoria and Albert embraced the new technology enthusiastically. They commissioned photographs, collected photographs, gave photographs as gifts. Images of the royal family circulated throughout Britain and the empire, creating a sense of intimacy between monarch and subjects that had never before been possible. People who would never see Victoria in person could own a photograph of her. She became, in a very real sense, the first modern celebrity monarch. The tiny woman had become, through technology, omnipresent. On May 1, 1876, Victoria was officially proclaimed Empress of India. The title formalized her sovereignty over what was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people, ancient civilizations, and unimaginable wealth. Disraeli orchestrated the Imperial Titles Act that conferred the new designation. He understood that Victoria craved recognition of her empire's magnificence. The Queen had been jealous of her daughter Vicky, who had married the heir to the Prussian throne and would eventually become Empress of Germany. Now Victoria had an imperial title of her own. She would sign documents Victoria R.I., Victoria Regina et Imperatrix, Queen and Empress, for the rest of her life. The woman who had once written in a behavior book at her mother's command now commanded an empire larger than Rome's at its height. The scale contrast had reached its maximum absurdity. 5 feet tall, 412 million subjects. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Albert died on December 14th, 1861. He was 42 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever, though modern historians have suggested he may have been suffering from longer-term illness, possibly stomach cancer or Crohn's disease. Victoria's grief was absolute, devastating, all-consuming. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, refused to perform ceremonial duties, rarely appeared in London. She dressed in black for the remaining 40 years of her life, never wearing colors again. She had Albert's rooms preserved exactly as they had been, his clothes laid out each day, hot water brought for his shaving. She became the Widow of Windsor, a queen who seemed to care more for her dead husband than for her living subjects. The withdrawal lasted years. In the decade following Albert's death, Victoria made only a handful of public appearances. She refused to open Parliament in person. She avoided London. She retreated to Balmoral in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, away from the demands of the capital. And into this void stepped John Brown. Brown was a Scottish servant, a gillie, who had attended the royal family during their visits to Balmoral since the 1850s. Albert had particularly valued his blunt, no-nonsense manner. After Albert's death, Victoria found in Brown a similar directness. He wasn't intimidated by her. He didn't treat her as fragile. He called her woman when he thought she was being difficult. He made her laugh. By 1864, Brown had become Victoria's personal attendant. He was with her constantly, at Balmoral, at Osborne, even at Windsor. The relationship shocked the court. A servant addressing the Queen as woman? A Highlander with weathered hands and a strong accent, holding such influence over the sovereign? The press noticed, and they were vicious. Satirical magazines published cartoons implying an inappropriate relationship. Punch ran jokes about Mrs. Brown. Scottish newspapers suggested the Queen had secretly married her servant. Some whispered that Brown was actually a medium who helped Victoria communicate with Albert's spirit, an accusation that carried a grain of truth, as Victoria did have an interest in spiritualism during this period. The scandal only deepened the public's sense that the Queen had lost touch with her duties. She was hiding in Scotland with a servant while the nation carried on without her. Republican sentiment surged. There's no credible evidence that Victoria's relationship with Brown was romantic or sexual. What seems clear is that he provided something she desperately needed: uncomplicated companionship, honest opinion, a connection to the outdoor life she and Albert had loved in Scotland. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria was devastated. She commissioned a life-size statue of him for Balmoral. She wrote a tribute to him that her advisors had to persuade her not to publish. But by then, the long winter of her withdrawal was finally thawing. Republican sentiment had reached its peak in 1871. Charles Dilke, a radical member of Parliament, gave speeches calling for the abolition of the monarchy. Clubs formed to promote republicanism. A motion to examine the Queen's expenditures passed the House of Commons. And then, fortune intervened. The Prince of Wales, Victoria's eldest son Bertie, the future Edward VII, fell seriously ill with typhoid fever, the same disease that had killed his father. The nation held its breath, and when he recovered, in December 1871, public sentiment swung dramatically back toward the monarchy. A service of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral drew massive crowds. Victoria, attending her first major public event in years, was cheered rapturously. It was a turning point. Gradually, carefully, Victoria began to re-emerge. She was coaxed and cajoled by ministers who understood that the monarchy's survival required a visible monarch. Disraeli was particularly effective, using flattery and the lure of the imperial title to draw her out. And when she finally emerged, transformed, it was as something new. No longer the partisan young woman of the bedchamber crisis, no longer the grief-stricken recluse of the 1860s and 1870s. She was now a symbol of endurance, of continuity, of national identity itself. The black clothes remained, the grief never entirely faded. But Victoria had found a way to transform her mourning into a kind of majesty. She was the widow of Windsor, yes, but she was also the grandmother of her people, ancient, enduring, eternal. The transformation was complete, and she was becoming grandmother to something else, the crowned heads of Europe. Victoria's 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters, married into royal families across the continent. This was deliberate. Albert had believed that placing their children on European thrones would spread liberal, constitutional values and reduce the likelihood of war between nations bound by family ties. The strategy was ambitious. The results were mixed. The legacy was historic. Victoria, the Princess Royal, known as Vicky, married Frederick, Crown Prince of Prussia, in 1858. She would eventually become Empress of Germany, though only briefly. Her son Wilhelm would become Kaiser Wilhelm II. Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Her daughter Alix would become Empress of Russia, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. Alfred married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, daughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. Louise married the Marquis of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll, a commoner by royal standards. Arthur married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. Leopold married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg. And Edward, the Prince of Wales, married Alexandra of Denmark, linking Britain to the Scandinavian monarchies. By the end of Victoria's reign, her descendants occupied or were married to the occupants of the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, Norway, Sweden, Greece, and Romania. She was the grandmother of Europe, a title she actively cultivated, summoning her royal grandchildren to family gatherings and mediating their disputes as only a matriarch could. The tragedy of this grand genealogical project would become clear only after her death. When the First World War began in 1914, Victoria's grandchildren would face each other across the trenches. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's eldest grandchild, the boy who had held her hand during family gatherings at Osborne, would be at war with King George V, Victoria's grandson who sat on the British throne, and both would be fighting against, and later betraying, Nicholas II, married to Victoria's granddaughter, Alexandra. The family ties didn't prevent war. If anything, they complicated the peace. But that's a story that belongs to the 20th century, not the 19th. What matters for our purposes is that Victoria's marriage strategy spread her bloodline across Europe, ensuring that even as individual thrones fell, the Saxe-Coburg genetic material endured. Elizabeth II would be descended from Victoria not just through her father's line, but through multiple connections across the tangled European royal family tree. The Golden Jubilee of 1887 and the Diamond Jubilee of 1897 were the culminating spectacles of Victoria's reinvention. For the Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years on the throne, Victoria rode in an open carriage through streets packed with cheering crowds. The same crowds that had grumbled about her absence a decade earlier now celebrated her presence with genuine warmth. Foreign royalty gathered to pay homage. 50 European kings, princes, and grand dukes attended the celebrations. Indian princes sent gifts of jewels and elephants. The empire itself seemed to materialize in London, its representatives parading through the capital to demonstrate the reach of Victorian power. Westminster Abbey filled with dignitaries for a service of thanksgiving. Victoria, now 68, was deeply moved. "This never-to-be-forgotten day will always remain seared in my heart," she wrote. And then, 10 years later, the Diamond Jubilee exceeded even this display. June 22, 1897. The weather was perfect. Troops from every corner of the empire marched through London in a procession that took hours to pass. Australians and Canadians, Indians and South Africans, Jamaicans and Cypriots, soldiers from Hong Kong and British Guiana, cavalry from the Cape, and infantry from New Zealand. The procession stretched for miles, a living map of Britain's global dominion with the tiny, elderly queen at its center. She rode in an open landau, drawn by 8 cream-colored horses. Along the route, crowds numbered in the millions. They cheered themselves hoarse. They wept. They threw flowers. Victoria was 82 years old by then. Her eyesight was failing. Her legs pained her. She had grown stout and slow. But she was also, at that moment, the most famous and most powerful woman in the world. She had reigned longer than any British monarch in history. She had presided over an empire that spanned the globe. She had survived grief that would have destroyed weaker souls. And she had transformed a precarious institution into a symbol of national identity. The Diamond Jubilee was her coronation in reverse, not the beginning of a reign, but its triumphant culmination. "How kind they are to me," she said of the crowds. "How kind." In her final years, Victoria developed a close relationship with an Indian attendant named Abdul Karim, known as the Munshi. She studied Hindustani under his instruction. She promoted him to the position of Indian secretary. She defended him fiercely against the racism of her court and household, who were scandalized that the queen would elevate a Muslim servant to such prominence. The parallels to John Brown were obvious, and the scandal was similar. But Victoria, now in her 80s, was beyond caring what her household thought. She had spent 18 years being told what to do. She would spend her final years doing exactly as she pleased. Victoria died on January 22, 1901. She had reigned for 63 years and 216 days, longer than any British monarch before her. She died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, her grandson, was there, helping to support her in her final hours. The empire she had ruled for so long would soon be torn apart by wars in which her descendants fought on opposite sides. But in that moment, at the end, the family gathered. She had been queen for most of her life, longer than most of her subjects had been alive. An entire era was named for her. Her death felt like the end of something permanent. But the most remarkable thing about her death wasn't its timing. It was what didn't happen afterward. The British monarchy didn't collapse. It adapted. And this is where we get to the heart of what Victoria actually built. By stripping the monarchy of direct partisan political power, by emphasizing symbolic and ceremonial duties over active governance, Victoria had created an adaptable institution. The British monarch didn't need to make government policy. She only needed to represent the nation. This meant that when governments fell, when policies failed, when the public raged against the decisions of Parliament, the crown remained above the fray. Victoria's constitutional restraint, her willingness, particularly in her later decades, to advise and warn rather than command, had created a monarchy that could bend without breaking. When the storms of the 20th century arrived, this flexibility would prove to be the difference between survival and extinction. Consider what happened to the other monarchies of Europe. The Russian Empire collapsed in 1917. Tsar Nicholas II, married to Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra, was executed with his entire family in a basement in Ekaterinburg on July 17, 1918. The German Empire fell in November 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, her eldest grandchild, the one who had held her as she died, fled into exile in the Netherlands, where he would spend the remaining 23 years of his life. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, the Habsburgs were gone, the Ottomans crumbled, across Europe, crowns toppled, republics rose. But the British monarchy survived, not because it was more powerful than the others. In fact, it was less politically powerful than many of them. The Russian Tsar had been an autocrat with absolute authority. The German Kaiser wielded significant constitutional power. They had real power. The British monarch had given most of that power away. And that's exactly why the British monarchy survived. Victoria had built something that didn't depend on political power for its legitimacy. An institution that could lose an empire and still mean something. A symbol that transcended the policies of any particular government. Her son, Edward VII, inherited this model. He was 60 years old when he finally became king. He had waited longer than any heir apparent in British history. His reign was short, just 9 years, but he continued the evolution Victoria had begun. Then came George V, who faced the ultimate test during the First World War. Britain was fighting Germany. The British royal family was German, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a name that sounded increasingly awkward as anti-German sentiment intensified. The Kaiser was George's cousin. The Tsar, fighting alongside Britain, was married to George's cousin. Europe's royal families were tearing each other apart. George V made a decision that epitomized the adaptability Victoria had built into the institution. In 1917, he changed the royal family's name from the German-sounding Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, named for the castle that had been a royal residence since William the Conqueror. It was a symbolic gesture, a rebranding, but it worked. The British monarchy distanced itself from its German origins at the moment when those origins had become a liability. Kaiser Wilhelm II reportedly joked that he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But Wilhelm ended up in exile, while George V remained on his throne. The monarchy didn't need to win wars or make policy. It needed to represent Britain. And when the moment demanded it, George V could remake the monarchy's very identity to maintain that connection. This was Victoria's legacy in action, an institution built to adapt and survive. George VI faced an even greater test during the Second World War. He had never expected to be king. His older brother Edward VIII had abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. George, known as Bertie to his family, was thrust onto the throne reluctantly, burdened by a severe stammer that made public speaking agonizing. But he rose to the moment. During the Blitz, when German bombs fell on London night after night, George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed. They visited bomb sites. They walked through ruins. They talked to survivors. They shared the dangers faced by ordinary Londoners. When Buckingham Palace itself was bombed on September 13, 1940, the Queen reportedly said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The monarchy as shared suffering. The monarch as symbol of national endurance. This was Victoria's legacy, a crown that derived its power from what it represented, not what it commanded. An institution that could stand alongside its people rather than above them. And then came Elizabeth. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born on April 21, 1926, 25 years after Victoria's death. She was Victoria's great-great-granddaughter, connected by a direct line. Victoria to Edward VII, to George V, to George VI, to Elizabeth. She was not expected to become queen. Her uncle Edward was heir to the throne, and he would surely marry and have children of his own. Elizabeth was third in line, then fourth, then, with the birth of her sister Margaret, comfortably distant from the succession. The abdication changed everything. Suddenly, her father was king. Suddenly, she was heir presumptive. Suddenly, the shy girl who loved horses and dogs was being prepared for a destiny she had never sought. When she became queen on February 6, 1952, at the age of 25, just 7 years older than Victoria had been at her accession, she inherited something remarkable. Not an empire, that was shrinking rapidly, with decolonization accelerating across Africa and Asia. Not political power, that had largely been surrendered to Parliament. But an institution. An institution that Victoria had built to survive exactly the kind of upheaval that the 20th century delivered. Elizabeth didn't just maintain that institution. She exceeded it. The parallels between the two queens are striking. Both became sovereign at a young age. Both were underestimated at the start of their reigns. Both were small in stature. Elizabeth was 5 feet 4 inches, only slightly taller than Victoria. Both reigned through periods of massive social and technological change. Both saw their realms transformed utterly over the course of their reigns. And both understood, instinctively, the essential lesson of constitutional monarchy. The crown survives by representing rather than ruling. Elizabeth navigated challenges that would have destroyed lesser institutions. The decolonization of Africa and Asia transformed the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association rather than an imperial hierarchy. The troubles in Northern Ireland tested British unity for decades. The death of Diana in 1997 provoked a crisis of public confidence that forced the monarchy to adapt once again. Through all of it, Elizabeth remained what Victoria had envisioned, a symbol above politics, a constant in a world of relentless change. On September 9, 2015, Elizabeth II became the longest reigning monarch in British history. She surpassed Victoria's record of 63 years and 216 days. The great-great-granddaughter had outlasted the great-great-grandmother. The moment was marked quietly. Elizabeth had never sought records or accolades. She was opening a railway line in Scotland when the milestone passed. Inevitably, a long life can pass by many milestones, she said. My own is no exception. But she kept going. Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years and 214 days, 7 years longer than Victoria. From the age of propeller planes to the age of smartphones, from Churchill to Liz Truss, from an empire of hundreds of millions to a commonwealth of shared history and values. She met every American president from Truman to Biden, except Lyndon Johnson. She saw 15 prime ministers serve under her. She posed for more than 200 official portraits. She was the most photographed woman in history. And when she died, on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the same Scottish estate Victoria had loved, an era ended. But the institution survived, because that's what Victoria built it to do. Think about the arc of this story for a moment. Victoria was born in 1819. Elizabeth II died in 2022. That's 185 years, nearly 2 centuries of British history, connected by a direct bloodline and an institutional inheritance. The tiny woman who demanded an hour alone on the morning she became queen created something that would outlive her by 121 years. The girl who couldn't walk down a staircase without someone gripping her hand built an institution that survived 2 world wars and the collapse of the British Empire itself. Victoria died 25 years before Elizabeth II was born. They never met, never spoke, never exchanged so much as a letter. But in a very real sense, Victoria created Elizabeth II's record-breaking reign. She created the constitutional monarchy that didn't compete with elected governments and therefore didn't fall when those governments changed. She created the ceremonial role that could adapt to radio, to television, to mass media, to the relentless scrutiny of the modern age. She created the expectation that the monarch would represent the nation rather than rule it, an expectation that allowed Elizabeth to serve for 70 years without generating the political conflicts that doomed other royal houses. The Kensington system tried to create a puppet. Instead, it created a sovereign. And that sovereign built something that lasted. There's a line that historians sometimes use to describe Victoria. They call her a very tiny woman on the western fringe of Europe. It's meant to capture the paradox, the scale contrast, the improbability of it all. 5 feet tall, confined to her mother's bedroom until she was 18, from a small island that had no business commanding a quarter of the globe. And yet, she presided over 35.5 million square kilometers, 412 million people, an empire that stretched from sunrise to sunrise around the entire planet. She transformed a politically entangled, publicly unpopular monarchy into an enduring symbol of national identity. She built an institution so durable that it survived everything the 20th century could throw at it: world wars, social revolutions, the end of empire, the rise of mass media. And she produced a great-great-granddaughter who didn't just inherit the throne. She broke Victoria's own record by 7 years. The empire Victoria ruled has long since dissolved. India is independent. So is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and dozens of other former colonies. The sun does set on British territory now. But Victoria's dynasty endures. Her great-great-great-grandson sits on the throne today. King Charles III, crowned in 2023, is the latest link in a chain that stretches back to that morning in 1837 when an 18-year-old girl in a dressing gown asked for an hour to herself. The institution she reshaped, stripped of political power, focused on symbolic meaning, built to adapt, continues to function more than a century and a half after that revolutionary request. That hour alone was the beginning of everything. The tiny woman built an empire, but more importantly, she built something that could outlast an empire. And her great-great-granddaughter proved it. Subscribe for more stories like this.